exactly had happened to her. When she had been captured and dragged here, she also instinctively looked up and locked eyes with a monstrous creature above. Only then did she realize how big the creature was. However, the smell of Fran's breath was indeed hard to bear. Agatha turned her head away before holding her breath and urged Fran to continue. Fran didn't know how to describe the creature to her. It almost looked like a mass of squashed organs overlaid with a bunch of eyeballs. It was almost as if both were crudely assembled together. Hearing this, everyone began to ponder. After a brief moment, they realized that they should prioritize how to escape here first. Elena patted Fran, asking if she was still able to move. Fran shook her head, saying she was completely drained and needed food. But the group's combined rations weren't even enough to fill the gaps in her teeth. Elena suggested waiting for rescue, but Agatha pointed out that the cramped space and lack of oxygen wouldn't sustain them for a day. Moreover, the demonic beasts had already gathered outside, and the first army was likely engaged in battle above them. Their small group had no chance of breaking out on their own. As for Fran, if they leave her here, she would have no way to resist. Nightingale turned away, didn't want to choose between the two, and decided to scout outside by herself. Fran then spoke up, telling them it's okay to leave her behind, since as a Takira witch, she had never feared sacrifice. However, she also remembered something inside her might still be of use to the group. She wiggled around, then writhed and slowly spit out several iron boxes covered in sticky saliva. Turned out, these were the first army's encampment supplies. She swallowed them since they would be easier to transport. Upon opening the box, various tools such as shovels and pickaxes were found, and in one of the boxes, Agatha was able to find a few items that looked like items made by the chemical department. Agatha immediately recognized these were all explosives. She quickly showed it to everyone, explaining how they worked, which the god punishment witches immediately thought this one of Roland's most powerful weapons. To them, these items were capable of moving mountains and splitting the earth. Suddenly, Elena threw the pickaxe away. She didn't look very happy, and neither were the Takira witches behind her. Elena angrily questioned if no one ever thought that these explosives could have detonated inside Fran. Agatha calmly explained the ones they had seen were just experimental prototypes in the laboratory. She then pulled out a packet with copper tubes and thin cords, explaining that these needed to be inserted into the explosive. Without such preparations, ordinary impacts wouldn't set them off. Realizing her impulsiveness, Elena apologized for her outburst. Agatha waved it off, urging everyone to gather around again. Curious, the other Takira witches began examining the explosives, handling them like children. However, Agatha herself was not very familiar with these items. Just then, Lightning approached and explained that those marked with red were fuse detonators that needed to be lit, while those with blue markings were pull detonators, activated simply by pulling the attached cord. There was also a type marked in yellow for electrical detonation, although they didn't seem to have it here. Agatha, impressed, asked how she knew this, to which Lightning replied that she always goes to check out First Army's newest weaponry. Quickly, they began brainstorming. They would bury the explosives at the entrance of the cave to blast a pathway, then carry Fran in retreat. If they encountered demonic beasts, they would continue to throw explosives behind them. Elena believed that if the explosives could hold off the enemies, they would be able to carry Fran. Fran tried to insist again that they could just leave her behind, but was quickly ignored. Although the Takira witches did not fear sacrifice, they absolutely could not abandon a sister. Agatha shook her head since igniting the explosives in such cramped space is also dangerous to them. However, if they moved to a more spacious cavern, the blast's effectiveness would be greatly diminished. Moreover, there were no firearms here, and there was no way they could fend off the remaining demonic beasts. They once again fell into silence until Nightingale appeared and sat on Fran, suggesting why not just get rid of the eye monster instead? Elena pointed out that they couldn't fly, perhaps forgetting about Lightning, but before Lightning could respond, Agatha interjected, noting that there were also demonic beasts nearby that could fly. Meanwhile, Lightning's mobility would be severely limited while carrying heavy loads, making her a target for the demonic beasts. Nightingale waved it off, telling them that she never planned to send Lightning in the first place. Instead, she will personally deliver the explosives into the monster's mouth. Agatha was stunned since Nightingale surely knew the monster could see through her ability. Nightingale merely smiled, telling her that while the monster could see her, the other demonic beasts could not. Reassuring everyone, as she began packing the explosives into her bag. Just as Agatha was about to say more, a familiar and unsettling sound came from behind them. Turning, they saw it was another devouring worm just like Fran. Clearly, the enemy had initiated an attack. Nightingale gestured to the others not to worry and once again disappeared into the mist. People may know her as Nightingale today, but from years ago her title had once echoed through the kingdom, and though some might have forgotten, she was once known as the assassin in the shadow. She gets into her ability, within the world of mist, and she quickly locates the monster. At the same time, they locked eyes. It's clear to her now that this monster was not a hybrid demonic beast, rather it was something else. Countless eyes turned towards Nightingale as she approached the monstrous creature, dodging through the demonic beasts that rushed in her direction, yet none of them could pinpoint her exact location. She leaped from one beast to another, drawing ever closer to her target. Suddenly, she sensed danger and quickly ducked. She dodged the attack and leaped back. Took her a second to realize it was the invisible mantis again. And it seems like these creatures could also see through her mist. Without hesitation, Nightingale charged towards the nearest mantis. It had been a long time since she'd felt the adrenaline rush of battling alone, a feeling that took her back to the days before she had met Wendy, Roland, and everyone else. Not long after, a small cut appeared on her arm, but she did not retreat. Instead, she continued to reap the lives of the mantis creatures while accumulating several wounds herself. Thankfully, her night suit, made of special material by Soraya, provided her with some protection. Memories of Wendy and Greycastle flooded her mind, realizing she wasn't truly alone. She drew her pistol, suddenly appearing in front of another mantis, and with a swift shot, blasted its head. She then fired more shots, killing more mantis. Clutching the wound on her abdomen, the pain causing her to break out in a cold sweat, there were still 5 more of them left. While battling the mantis, Nightingale pondered how this creature was able to command all of these demonic beasts. It has the ability to orchestrate their attacks with a level of coordination that she had never seen before. Such a creature was undoubtedly a significant threat to the city of Neverwinter and especially to Roland himself. By now, the pistol had run out of bullets and she wasn't given time to reload, leaving her no choice but to holster her pistol. She quickly dashed towards one of the mantis, maneuvered to its back, then dragged it into her mist. At the same time, one of the creature's tentacles lunged at Nightingale. However, this was all part of her plan. Pulling a mantis into the mist not only increased the rate of her magic consumption but also destabilized the mist world. However, this could be very useful. As the tentacle strike landed, it came in contact with the mist world, causing it to disorientate, causing it to accidentally take out the last of the mantises. Emerging from the mist world, the corpses of the mantises were strewn about, and the remaining demonic beasts began to fear Nightingale. The creature then let out a roar. Seeing the opportunity, she dashed forward. Up close, she didn't see a mouth but instead spotted an opening where an organ resembling a heart. She wondered if placing the explosive there could inflict significant damage. As the monster's tentacles continued their relentless assault, she dodged every attack while closing in on her target. With a sudden leap, she pulled out her backpack and stuffed the entire bag into the opening, swiftly pulling the detonator cord. She then kicked off the creature, using the recoil to propel herself backward, and plummeted towards an underground lake below. The monster let out another roar, and she suddenly thought what Roland had once said, a true warrior never looks back at the explosion. She let out a smile, however she was too tired even to turn her head. Then, the monster's body began to swell and a thunderous boom echoed as it was blown to pieces, its screams mingling with the sound of the explosion. The blast created a vortex in the lake, and using the last ounce of her strength, Nightingale re-entered the mist world to quickly surface and crawl out of the water. Let's just pause here for a second. Anyway, as she lay powerless on the shore before she fainted, a devouring worm burst through the wall. Moments later, the group watched with concern. Fran anxiously asked if Nightingale was alright, and Agatha carefully checked her, finding there were several injuries, and how Nightingale had depleted all her magic. Elena gently lifted the unconscious Nightingale, and the group prepared to make a swift exit. However, the writhing, twisted monster above them continued to emit painful howls. Clearly, it wasn't completely dead. However, Agatha doesn't want to risk anything right now, and they should escape first, and let the first army would handle the rest. Lightning pouted and slowly put her dagger back. Just then, as they were about to leave, giant skeletal hands surged from the water and dragged the monster down into the depths. However, the monster looked at the group one last time. The hatred was evident in its eyes. Meanwhile, outside, the demonic beasts finally began to retreat. The first army soldiers cheered, one grumbling as he looked at his smoking heavy machine gun, saying how these beasts are not as fearsome as the God Punishment Army from the church. Another guy disagreed, telling him to not get ahead of himself. Without the weapon created by His Majesty, they would still be fighting demonic beasts with spears and arrows. Their captains ordered them to stop talking and began changing gun barrels and reloading their ammunition. Edith watched the soldiers and thought to herself that some of the demonic beasts clearly showed some level of intelligence. She saw many of the hybrid beasts and how they sat on the side, not charging at them but rather howling as if encouraging other demonic beasts to charge. At the thought of this, she began to wonder just what or who was commanding them. And what was the connection between the earlier sound and the demonic beasts? Edith couldn't figure it out, and perhaps only Roland could provide the answers. Her contemplations were interrupted by Brian, who hastily approached to pay his respects. Edith had been instrumental in their success, and Brian insisted on reporting the full details to the king. While Edith merely smiled, saying he didn't need to include her in the report. However, Brian didn't want to steal the credit, since, without Edith, things could end up very ugly. Seeing his persistence, Edith chose not to argue further. As Brian saluted once more before returning to his troops, Edith thought to herself why the king had chosen a patrol captain from a remote border town for such a significant military position. Perhaps, loyal to the king and inherently brave and upright were likely why Roland entrusted him with such responsibility. Since command skills and strategic insights could be developed over time, the character was far harder to alter. Edith then stretched her body, looking into the sunlight, thinking to herself that perhaps she had truly been accepted as part of the First Army. A few days later, back in Neverwinter, Roland had also received the latest updates. The news of Nightingale made him very concerned, but he was relieved to hear she was doing fine. Soraya even drew a portrait of Nightingale alongside the remains of the monster. Perhaps it was her way of signaling to him that she was all right. Roland studied the portrait. The monster was not just an ugly demonic beast. Not only did it wrap both humans and demons in these pods, but perhaps suggested it was trying to collect intel for both species. And the hatred it showed when it was dragged back into the water by skeletal claws, compared to before, almost seemed like it had two personalities. What was it trying to convey? Not long after, there was a knock on the door. Phyllis came to relay a message that Pasha wanted to discuss the exploration of the snowy mountains. Moments later, Roland also called Scroll over. As they entered the main hall, several God Punishment witches greeted Roland with the highest form of respect, hands pressed to their chests. Roland immediately recognized them as Folly and everyone else. However, they looked nothing like them in the dream world. Stepping into the hall, Pasha was already waiting on the screen. She bowed to Roland, expressing her gratitude for allowing the witches to enter the dream world and for the opportunity to explore the ruins. Roland tells her that doing so was also helping himself. He then asked Pasha if she had figured out how to retrieve the carriers from the ruins. Pasha outlined two methods, either physically moving the carriers back or bringing the instrument there. She preferred the latter. However, there was still the question of whether the Takira witches were still willing to fuse their souls with carriers. When Roland inquired whether Pasha had already selected candidates for this task, she reassured him that there was no need to worry. Everyone knew that the carriers could manipulate the magic cores, and the devouring worms could help accelerate the construction of defensive lines. As long as it benefited the Divine War, the Takira witches would not hesitate. He then shared the intelligence he had gathered about the monster with Pasha, seeking her insights. Shortly after, Celine and Alethea joined them, and after a long silence, they agreed with Roland's suspicions. This creature was neither a demonic beast nor a demon. Instead, Lady Natalia also depicted a similar skeletal creature in the third painting. Perhaps this was the last unknown civilization. Roland had anticipated this outcome. The goal of exploring the snowy mountains was to grab intel for this unknown civilization. Through some fragmented memories from Zero, he had glimpses of similar records, but with the confirmation of the Takira witches, he felt more confident. He pondered why the demonic beasts were listening to the monster's command. Could it be that these beasts were also a part of this hidden civilization? If that's the case, why didn't the enemy simply amass the demonic beasts and obliterate humanity and demons in one fell swoop? Yet, they only seemed to come out during the month of the demons. He guessed that only when the Divine War started, then he get his answer. Regardless, their ultimate goal remained the same. It was to defeat the enemy altogether. Pasha paused but agreed with Roland. However, Roland thought that since they identified the adversary as a hidden civilization, it seemed appropriate to give it a name. Pasha wasn't convinced that naming was important. After all, people refer to demons as demons because that is the most common term, though they had been called by other names in the past. Roland, however, smiled and explained that a fitting name was vital to their morale. The more sinister the name, the more it would ignite a spirit of resistance among the people. Pasha blinked her big eyes as Roland suggested calling them sea monsters, prompting a moment of silence in the room. Alethea couldn't help but murmur that she thought the third border town was already a terrible name, and now there was an even worse one. Pasha quickly tapped her on the head with her tentacle, and hurriedly apologized, saying the name was fine, though her tone was clearly reluctant. Suddenly, Scroll coughed and suggested to Roland, why not call them deep-sea demons instead? After all, the concept of demons was already deeply ingrained in people's minds, and since these beings lived in the deep sea, it would make things simpler. Roland shrugged, somewhat reluctantly, but it is what it is. Let's return to Lorca. Right now, she found herself in a forest, however, because the month of the demons just ended. Only the barren branches remained on the trees. She transformed back into her human form and put on some clothes. With her ears perked up, she heard sounds not far away. Soon, she discovered a port, the territory of Greenwater Harbor. Lorca boldly walked in and quickly spotted someone dressed like a soldier from the First Army. She hurriedly asked them where are they stationed, wanting to find Ashes, but then, turning her head, she caught sight of someone. Ashes smiled at her, having already anticipated her arrival. Lorca's ears twitched and wondered how she knew. Ashes, smiling, explained that Lorca reminded herself of years ago. While Lorca was naturally inclined towards battle, Ashes was driven by vengeance. Anyway, Ashes wanted to take Lorca to explore the town a little bit. Lorca was curious about whom Ashes sought vengeance against. Turned out that it was the church. However, Ashes later followed up saying how she found more important things in life, which was Tilly. Ashes' tone softened when she spoke of Tilly. Lorca in her mind thought that this person named Tilly must have been very important to Ashes. As they ventured into town, she observed many people helping the sand people build houses. She was quite surprised and thought these people were sent by Roland, but Ashes corrected her. They were workers who volunteered to come here, since working here also earned much higher wages, and many had applied, filling the municipal hall. Lorca, unfamiliar with the term municipal hall, grew even more concerned. With so many sand people relocating and the king not using them as labor, she wondered what was really going on. Ashes quickly explained that most people were heading to Endless Cape, where Roland planned to build a new city, and a lot of sand people were heading there. Although Lorca trusted Ashes, she couldn't help but doubt the feasibility of building a city on barren land, since Endless Cape is known for being completely empty and not suitable for living. Ashes followed up saying as for those who did not go, they could stay here and do whatever they could to help. End of the day, no one will be hungry. Ashes smiled and said that perhaps this was also what Tilly wanted to see, even though it was her seemingly unreliable brother who made it happen. When Lorca learned that Roland intended to extract black water in the Endless Cape, she swished her tail, questioning why it wouldn't be better to just purchase it from Iron Sand City. Ashes shook her head, she didn't know the reason either. She is just following Tilly's order, which was to assist Roland. As they continued to walk through the city, a young girl not far from them waved excitedly at Lorca, and her parents also smiled kindly at her. Lorca was slightly surprised, however she smiled back at them, whispering, this place really is different. Throughout her journey here, the people never showed any signs of shock or disgust at her skin color, or even her ears and tail. Ashes then brought up Maisie, who had a similar ability as Lorca, telling her that Maisie could transform into an even more terrifying creature than her. In the entire Grey Castle, no one will ever discriminate against a witch. Hearing this, made Lorca ponder if this was where she could truly be herself. Thinking about this, she asked Ashes if she was the strongest witch here. Ashes stroked her chin thoughtfully and replied that it depended on whether if she carried the Stone of God punishment. Without the stone, there were several members of the Witch Union she would likely lose to. Since several of them have their ability evolved, she can't just win by strength and speed. For instance, Leaf could control entire forests, making her unbeatable in her domain. Similarly, Anna, even if not super skilled in combat, her ability is extremely deadly and powerful. More importantly, she was Roland's darling. Lorca's eyes sparkled upon knowing there were so many powerful witches. Ashes then talked about Nightingale, whose abilities were the most mysterious. Ashes advised Lorca not to seek her out for a duel. Lorca silently repeated these names to herself, eager to meet them. As for Maisie, whom Ashes had mentioned earlier, she also advised Lorca to not fight her. Those who had done so had ended up very unlucky, and injuring her could provoke the wrath of the entire Witch Union. Lorca was startled by the description of Maisie, thinking she must be a very terrifying witch, perhaps even a ruling member of the Witch Union. Curious, Lorca asked Ashes what if she carried the stone. Ashes then asks what Lorca thinks about someone who possessed speed and strength comparable to an extraordinary witch, as well as almost immortal, who can't feel pain and could rapidly recover from injuries. Hearing this, Lorca widened her eyes in disbelief. Ashes had only met Phyllis once, during a sword training session where she gave her some advice after seeing her swinging her sword. Afterward, she noticed her movements were smoother. Clearly, Phyllis was very adept in combat. This made Lorca realize just how powerful someone had to be to offer such valuable insights after just one observation. In her mind, Phyllis was now the strongest person in Neverwinter, and she was even more excited about this journey. Ashes then revealed that there were over 100 witches just like Phyllis in Neverwinter. Lorca ears perked up. Ashes gave her a thumbs up, telling her to keep her spirit up. Moments later, Andrea came by, laughing heartily. She tells Lorca that asking Ashes about complex matters was pointless, joking that her head was full of muscles. Lorca was still interested in learning about Roland's plan and ideas, since her father had once said that learning something new would help her improve her combat skills as well. Andrea, with a shrug, wasn't sure if that was the case. Either way, she began to explain why Roland didn't just buy black water from Iron Sand City directly. If they used gold to buy black water, the city of Neverwinter would be trading a portion of its wealth for the goods. And if this trade continued for 20 years, Roland would lose a lot of gold with little else changing. Lorca didn't understand why Andrea said lose. In her view, expending substantial manpower and resources on extraction was the real cost. Andrea shook her head, picked up a stick, and started drawing in the dirt to explain further. The sand people who had moved were now part of Grey Castle. They needed daily necessities and resources from the city of Neverwinter, and the money they generated would be used to purchase these. Eventually, the money flowed back to Roland. Over time, the circulation of assets would increase, and the initial investment would not be lost but rather continue to circulate within Grey Castle. Lorca thought about it and disagreed. The money might not always be in Neverwinter, but rather be different part of the kingdom. Andrea smiled and kept explaining that Roland had always considered the entire Grey Castle as one territory. Regardless of where the wealth circulated to within the kingdom, it was still his. Lorca thought, isn't that what all rulers and kings think? Then Andrea asked Lorca about when their clan was in charge, and whether they could control all of the other clans. Lorca shook her head. Even in Iron Sand City, her clan wasn't the only clan in charge. She quickly realized what Andrea was trying to say, whether it was nobles, other kings, or chiefs, no one would treat another's territory as their own territory, even if it's the same kingdom. Andrea playfully patted Lorca on the shoulder, teasing that she was smart and should spend less time with Ashes, or she might become as stupid as she is. Since Roland had absolute control over the entire kingdom, the massive changes in the kingdom all credit to similar policies. Lorca looked at Andrea, surprised that this beautiful, blonde woman was answering her questions so thoroughly. It made Lorca wonder if Andrea had always wanted to share these insights but never had anyone to discuss them with. Andrea continued, stating that politics were more complex than just fighting. Roland gained not just wealth, but also their allegiance. She explained that as the Sand People migrated to Grey Castle, they would start new lives, gradually adapting to their new surroundings, continually learning, exchanging labor for goods, and no longer having to fight over land and resources. Eventually, they would truly become citizens of Grey Castle, which would continue to strengthen under Roland's leadership. This was why Roland's vision extended beyond merely acquiring black water. Lorca nodded and thought to herself that Andrea didn't hesitate to share the king's plan with her, maybe not necessarily out of trust, but she knew no one could stop these changes. Hearing these policies only made her more curious about this king, or as the Sand People would call him, their great chieftain. Lorca bowed to Andrea, expressing that she felt her combat skills had strengthened. After saying this, Lorca had already walked away, eager to start training again. Watching Lorca leave, Andrea couldn't help but smile, thinking to herself that Lorca and Ashes really were quite alike in their simplicity. 2 days later, Lorca was ready to head over to Neverwinter at the port, and the witches bid farewell to Lorca. Meanwhile, on the other side, in a mansion, Otto's maid informed him that a guest had arrived. The man who entered removed his hood. Without wasting time, Otto opened a stone door, which he said was leading to the rear garden, which served as a reliable escape route. Hill was very cautious. He threw down a coin and listened for a moment before nodding in approval. He instructed Otto to send secret letters for any future communications. Otto on the other side thought it was still dangerous even with secret letters, especially since any leak of information from the palace would lead to immediate suspicion towards the 3 major families, particularly how their relationship with the new king had changed dramatically compared to when they were just children. Hill then asked if Otto knew if their king had new plans. Otto spoke gravely. He revealed that Ampian was preparing to attack the church to avenge his father.